Hello, friends, and welcome back to The Snoozy Scientist, where we gently explore the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. Whether you're listening from your bed, curled up in a warm nest of blankets, or drifting through that quiet space where thoughts begin to blur, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we're going to drift slowly into one of the most haunting and mysterious stories on Earth. A story about presence and absence, about our cousins who once walked beside us, and why they no longer do. Because for most of human history, we weren't alone. Homo sapiens, as we now call ourselves, shared this planet with other kinds of humans. We are just one of at least 20 other human species we know of. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis. We were all different branches of the same family tree that once stretched wide across the world. These were real humans, not beasts. They walked, hunted, sang, and dreamed just like us. Some of them may have even loved more deeply than we do. They built tools, made jewelry, buried their dead. Some had bigger brains, some were stronger, and we even interbred with them. They were just us in different forms, but now we are the last humans left. Over 99% of all human species are gone, extinct. So what happened to them? Did we drive them to extinction? Was it something they lacked or something we had? Or was it just luck? Tonight, we drift backward through time into caves, across frozen tundra, and along the genetic threads that tie us together. We'll uncover the science behind the rise and fall of our forgotten cousins and explore why we survived while they didn't. If you're already enjoying this quiet journey together, it would mean so much if you gave this video a gentle like or maybe subscribed if you'd like more sleepy science stories like this one. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to know, where are you winding down from tonight? What time is it there? It's always a joy to see how far across the world this little sleepy corner of science travels. So now, take a breath, let your shoulders soften, and let's begin. Not so long ago, if you were to wander across the ancient plains of Africa, or follow the winding trails through dense forests in Europe or Asia, you might have come across another kind of human, not a stranger, not a creature, but someone who looked almost like you. Their posture was upright, their hands were skilled, their eyes held thought. They were human, just not Homo sapiens, because there was a time not so far back in the vast river of history when we were not the only ones. We lived among others, real people, just like us, but from different branches of our extended family. A family that once stretched wide and wild across the world, a world once filled with humans. Today, we are used to thinking of evolution as a ladder, one rung leading to the next, until it ends with us standing proudly at the top. But that isn't how it happened. Evolution isn't a ladder, it's a forest, a tangled living network of paths and possibilities, of branches that sprouted and bloomed and then disappeared. Scientists have identified at least 20 distinct species in the human lineage, not just ancient apes, but true hominins, tool makers, fire carriers, walkers of upright paths. And that number may only be the beginning. The fossil record is full of missing pages, washed away by time, hidden beneath stone or forest or desert. Some of our relatives may never be found at all, but others are still emerging from the dust, one discovery at a time. This ancient family included not just the famous ones, like the Neanderthals or the Denisovans, but lesser-known relatives with names that feel unfamiliar, like Homo rudolfensis, Homo ergaster, Homo habilis. Each one was once a living being. They had mothers and children and stories we'll never hear. From around 300,000 years ago, Several of these human species were alive at the same time. They lived in different regions, adapted to different climates, with different bodies and tools and ways of life. Some may have crossed paths, some may have ignored each other, some, as we now know, likely mated and shared more than just the land beneath their feet. Neanderthals roamed the rugged landscapes of Europe and parts of Western Asia. Thick boned and cold adapted, they made spears and carved symbols and may have spoken with voices like ours. Denisovans lived deeper in Asia, their presence only known through traces in DNA and a few precious bones. Their genetic echoes live on in many of us today. Further east, isolated on the island of Flores in Indonesia, lived tiny humans barely over 3 feet tall. Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the hobbits. Their small size wasn't a flaw, it was an adaptation. On small islands with limited resources, nature sometimes favors the little. There was Homo erectus, too, tall, sturdy, and incredibly successful. They left Africa nearly 2 million years ago and spread as far as Indonesia and China. They were the first to truly roam, the first to build fires, the first to make stone tools that didn't just survive, but lasted for thousands of years. For most of our existence, it was Homo erectus, not Homo sapiens, who carried the human name across continents. And of course, there were those closer to our own origin. In Africa, where we first appeared, lived other human species like Homo naledi, a puzzling mix of primitive and advanced traits. They had small brains, yet may have buried their dead deep within caves. What they thought, what they feared, what they believed, we may never know. Humanity, in those days, was a mosaic, a living patchwork of different bodies, minds, and ways of being. Some were short, some tall, some built tools of bone, others of stone, some stayed in forests, others walked open plains, but they were all human. They all belonged to the same extended family, just not the same final branch. And they weren't scattered randomly. Their footprints spanned the globe, from the southern tip of Africa to the frosty caves of Siberia, from the grassy plains of Europe to the volcanic highlands of Indonesia. Even on tiny islands, surrounded by nothing but water and sky, traces of ancient humans remain. It's hard to imagine now, a planet where you could meet another kind of person, someone shaped by the same past, but walking a different path. And yet, for tens of thousands of years, that was the norm. They lived in the same world as us, breathed the same air, stared up at the same stars. They saw lightning and fire, and fear and beauty, just through slightly different eyes. The idea that we were never alone, not until recently, changes something. It stretches our sense of identity. It reminds us that being human was once plural, a shared condition, not a singular crown, but a field of voices, and all those voices have gone quiet. Their stories, whatever they were, didn't vanish all at once. Some faded slowly, some were buried in ice, some were absorbed into us, their bloodline flowing on inside our cells. Others left only silence, a missing name in the branches of the tree. But that tree is still here, and we are one of its leaves, the last one, still holding on. If you stood in Ice Age Europe thousands of years ago, the world around you would feel both familiar and alien. Cold winds rolled across vast tundra, herds of animals moved through valleys, steam rising from their bodies in the morning air. Fire flickered inside caves, and somewhere nearby, a pair of dark eyes watched the horizon, steady, focused, and fully human. But not like us. These eyes belonged to a Neanderthal. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals lived across Europe and parts of Western and Central Asia. Their footprints are pressed deep into the soil of what would one day become France, Germany, Russia, even the Middle East. They were not wanderers passing through. This was their home long before it was ours. Their bodies were shaped by that land. They were shorter than us, but broader, thick bones, wide shoulders, strong hands. Their chests were barrel-shaped, built to hold warmth. Their limbs were compact, reducing heat loss in the cold. Everything about them was carved by the ice and wind they lived within. Some scientists believe they even had a unique nose shape, broad and long, to warm air before it reached their lungs, a natural adaptation for survival in sub-zero climates. And then there was their hair. The idea that all Neanderthals were shaggy and dark-haired has slowly melted away. Genetic studies suggest that at least some had pale skin and red or light-colored hair. Freckles might not have been rare. They may have looked in some small ways like people you pass on the street today. But beneath that surface, something remarkable waited: their brains. The average Neanderthal brain was larger than ours, not smaller, not simpler, just different. Their skulls were longer and lower, with more space in the back of the head. This may have supported advanced visual processing and movement control, abilities critical for hunting, tracking, and navigating rugged terrain. While we often imagine ourselves as the smart ones, the truth is more complicated. They were intelligent in a way perfectly suited to their world. They knew how to make tools, not just basic stones, but carefully shaped flakes, blades, and scrapers. Some tools were sharpened for cutting meat, others for shaping hides, building shelters, or digging in tough soil. Many were made using a technique known as prepared core technology, where a larger stone was shaped precisely to produce specific flake sizes. This took planning and skill, an understanding of physics and force passed down through generations. They worked together. They hunted in groups, not just scavengers waiting for leftovers, but cooperative hunters capable of taking down massive prey: bison, reindeer, even woolly mammoths. These hunts required timing, communication, and courage, and when one of them was injured in the process, something extraordinary happened. They didn't leave them behind. We found Neanderthal skeletons with crushed legs, broken bones, and serious injuries that had healed over time. These individuals would have been unable to hunt or even walk for weeks, maybe longer, but they lived. That means someone fed them, protected them, stayed by their side until the pain faded. This kind of care tells us something powerful. Neanderthals looked after one another, and when one of them died, the care didn't always stop. In several locations, Neanderthal remains have been found in what appear to be deliberate burials, shallow pits carved into the earth, the bodies curled gently in a fetal position. In one cave in Iraq, a skeleton was discovered surrounded by pollen, leading some to believe that flowers had been placed at the grave. Whether for ritual or respect, it speaks to a mind capable of grief, a mind that wondered where life goes when it ends. But they didn't just bury their dead. They may have created beauty too. Long before Homo sapiens reached Europe, some Neanderthals were already painting. In a cave in Spain, red pigments carefully placed on stalactites were dated to over 64,000 years ago. That's before any known modern human art in the region. These marks weren't random, they were symbols, intentional, and they lasted. They also used shells and animal teeth, sometimes painted, possibly worn as jewelry. Pigments have been found at sites far from their natural sources, hinting at long-distance travel or trade. These were not primitive minds. These were expressive ones, minds that saw the world not just as something to survive, but something to understand, and perhaps even decorate. And they did all of this for a very long time. Neanderthals were not a brief chapter. They lived for more than 300,000 years. That's 3 times longer than our own species has existed so far. In that time, they endured ice ages, predators, changing landscapes. They raised children. They learned. They adapted. They watched the stars turn overhead, season after season. year after year. Their story is not a shadow beneath ours. It is a parallel path that stretched long and far, and somewhere along that path it ended. But the memory of them, of their breath in frozen air, their tools, their bones, their art, remains etched into the caves, into the earth, and into the quiet places of our own DNA. Far to the east, beyond the familiar lands of the Neanderthals, where icy winds sweep down from the Siberian mountains and the nights stretch long and still, there is a cave. It's a quiet place. From the outside, there is little to suggest that anything remarkable ever happened there. Just a shadowed hollow in the side of a limestone cliff, nestled in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. But inside that cave, inside its cold stone walls and layers of ancient sediment, lies the story of a human people almost lost to time. For a long time, no one even knew they had existed. In 2008, deep inside this cave, a team of archaeologists found a tiny fragment of bone. It was part of a finger, a pinky, no more than the size of a coin. At first glance, it didn't seem extraordinary, just another piece of ancient bone among many others. But what happened next would open a doorway to one of the most mysterious chapters in human history. When scientists extracted DNA from that finger, what they found didn't match any known species. It wasn't Homo sapiens. It wasn't Neanderthal. It was something else entirely, a different kind of human. They named them the Denisovans, after the cave where the finger was found, Denisova Cave. And just like that, a whole new branch of the human family tree was revealed, not through a skull or a skeleton, but through code, through ancient genetic threads that had quietly survived for tens of thousands of years. Unlike Neanderthals, who left behind many bones and tools, the Denisovans left us very little. Just a few teeth, part of a jaw, a scrap of skull. There is no full skeleton, no face we can fully reconstruct. Their physical form remains mostly hidden, but inside that hiddenness is something extraordinary, because while their bones may be few, their DNA is everywhere. In modern populations across Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Islands of Melanesia, and among indigenous Australians, traces of Denisovan ancestry remain. In some communities, up to 5% of the genome can be linked to these ancient people. Even in Tibet, high in the Himalayan mountains, Denisovan genes help modern humans survive at extreme altitudes by controlling how the body uses oxygen in thin air. This means the Denisovans weren't just hiding in a single cave. They were spread across vast regions of Asia. They climbed, they traveled, they adapted, and they met us. At some point, perhaps more than once, Homo sapiens and Denisovans crossed paths. They may have traded words, shared tools, built fires together. They may have raised children, and those children carried forward the DNA of both worlds. Even in places where no Denisovan bones have been found, their genetic footprints remain. That's part of what makes them so mysterious. Their legacy exists not in stone, but in blood. Back inside Denisova Cave, however, there are clues that this was more than just a shelter from the cold. Layers of ash show that fires were lit here, again and again, over thousands of years. The floors are rich with the remnants of tools, some of them surprisingly advanced: thin stone blades, bone needles, carefully carved ornaments. One bracelet made of green chlorite, polished to a shine, was drilled with a rotating tool, something many thought only modern humans could use. The workmanship is precise, elegant. Whoever made it had steady hands and a patient mind. This suggests that Denisovans were more than rugged survivors. They were inventors, creators, capable of shaping the world with more than just instinct. In fact, the deeper scientists dig into the cave's layers, the more complex the picture becomes. At some points in time, Denisovans and Neanderthals seem to have shared the space, And once, in a twist almost too strange to imagine, a bone fragment was found belonging to a girl who had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, two worlds meeting in a child. It's the only direct offspring of two different human species ever identified, a quiet reminder that our boundaries were never as firm as we imagine. The edges of our history blur, the lines between them and us begin to fade. And yet, even as science uncovers more about the Denisovans, so much remains out of reach. We don't know what they looked like. We don't know what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped for. We don't know their names, not the ones they called themselves. All we have are traces, tools, teeth, the occasional spark of brilliance left behind in stone, and the quiet pulse of their DNA still flowing in millions of people today. They are ghosts in the code, not gone, not fully, just waiting quietly to be remembered. Long before the caves of Europe echoed with the voices of Neanderthals, long before the Denisovans carved bracelets in the mountains of Siberia, there was another kind of human, older, tougher, and astonishingly resilient. Their name was Homo erectus, the upright man, and for nearly 2 million years they walked this earth. That's not a typo. 2 million, compared to our own species, Homo sapiens, who have only been around for about 300,000 years. Homo erectus was a monument of endurance. They were pioneers in every sense of the word. They were the first humans to leave Africa, stepping into the unknown with nothing but stone tools and determination. It's easy to imagine them under the sun, crossing dry grasslands, climbing unfamiliar mountains, watching the horizon change as they moved farther from their birthplace. With each step, they expanded the reach of humanity, not through grand plans or ambition, but through survival. They didn't travel in great migrations. They didn't need to. Over generations, they followed herds, rivers, and seasons. They found new places to live, and they stayed. From the rolling hills of modern-day Georgia to the steamy jungles of Indonesia, Homo erectus made a home across 3 continents: Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe. And in those far-flung places, they didn't just scrape by. They built fires. They crafted tools, simple, yes, but consistent and useful. Their hand axes were shaped with a level of skill that remained almost unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew what worked, and they didn't need to reinvent it. They cooked their food, making it easier to digest, giving their bodies more energy. They hunted in groups, watched over their young, and adapted to climates that would have overwhelmed others. Their bones show a strong build, especially in the legs, a body made for walking long distances, for endurance. They weren't fast, but they kept going, and they kept going, and going, for longer than any other human species in history. There's something awe-inspiring about that kind of longevity. Imagine a human line that began before the Ice Age and lasted until just 100,000 years ago. By then, Neanderthals were rising in Europe, Denisovans were spreading through Asia, and Homo sapiens, our species, was just beginning to step into the wider world. But Homo erectus had already been there, watching fires burn under foreign stars, watching children grow in strange lands, carving out a life in places we once thought unreachable. In Indonesia, on the island of Java, fossils of Homo erectus were discovered that date back over 1.5 million years, and some may be as recent as 108,000 years ago. That's incredibly close to our own timeline. For a brief moment in Earth's history, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens may have all been alive at the same time. 4 different kinds of humans sharing the planet, each shaped by their own struggles, each carrying a piece of what it means to be us. And yet, Homo erectus vanished. We don't know exactly why. They left no written words, no carved symbols, just bones, tools, and silence. Some believe they were slowly replaced, outcompeted by other humans who were more flexible, more social, or more advanced in their tools and communication. Others wonder if environmental shifts, volcanic eruptions, or rising sea levels played a role. Maybe their isolated groups became too small, too scattered. Maybe they faded away without a fight, like the last embers of a once great fire. But whatever the cause, one truth remains: they survived longer than any of us, longer than Homo sapiens have lasted so far, longer than we may last. They didn't need complex language or ornate art to leave their mark. Their endurance was their legacy. They carried the human story across continents before we ever picked up the pen, and in their footsteps we followed. It's humbling to think about that before we built cities, before we painted caves or launched rockets into the sky, there were Homo erectus families sitting around firelight, passing the night together under unfamiliar stars, watching, waiting, living. Their voices are lost to time, but their journey echoes on, not in our DNA like the Denisovans, but in the very shape of our path. They were the ones who first looked beyond the horizon and moved toward it. The ones who believed there was something worth walking toward, even if they didn't know what it was yet. And that quiet courage, that slow, persistent wandering, would open the world for all who came after. Far from the snowy caves of the Denisovans and the wide steppes of Homo erectus, there is a very different kind of place. An island, warm, humid, wrapped in green, surrounded by turquoise waters and craggy limestone hills, the island of Flores in Indonesia. It was here, in a cave called Liang Bua, that scientists uncovered something completely unexpected. Buried beneath layers of earth and time, they found bones, not fragments, not broken bits, but nearly complete skeletons. At first, they looked almost like modern humans, the shape of the jaw, the structure of the legs. But there was something different, strikingly different. These people were tiny. The adults stood just 3.5 feet tall, about the height of a modern 3-year-old child. Their skulls were small, holding brains no larger than a grapefruit, yet they were clearly human. They walked upright. They made tools. They hunted. They lived. They were given a name, Homo floresiensis, but around the world they quickly became known by another nickname, the hobbits, and while the name might sound playful, their existence is anything but a fantasy. The discovery of Homo floresiensis shook the scientific world. How could such a small species of human survive, isolated, fragile, and seemingly primitive on an island in the middle of the ocean? The answer, it turns out, may lie in the island itself. Islands are strange places. They shape life in unusual ways. When large animals arrive on islands, they often become smaller over generations. Food is limited, predators are few, bigger bodies are harder to maintain, and so, bit by bit, nature trims them down. This process is called island dwarfism, and it's been seen in elephants, hippos, and now, perhaps, humans. Homo floresiensis may have descended from a larger species, possibly even Homo erectus, who arrived on Flores long ago. Over time, they shrank, not because of weakness, but because smallness was an advantage. It meant needing less food, surviving on fewer resources, and navigating dense island forests with ease. Inside Liangbua Cave, archaeologists found simple tools, flakes of sharp stone, shaped by hand. These tools were used for cutting meat, working plant fibers, and butchering animals, and not just small ones. Bones of giant rats and pygmy elephants, known as stegodon, were also found nearby. Some show signs of being hunted and processed. Imagine that, a 3-foot tall human facing off against a miniature elephant. They lived in small groups. They likely slept together in shelters or in caves. They may have used fire, although evidence of this is still debated. And they lived not tens of thousands, but possibly hundreds of thousands of years on this island, in almost total isolation. But the most astonishing part of their story isn't their size, it's how recent their story might be. For a long time, it was believed that Homo floresiensis had gone extinct around 50,000 years ago, but newer evidence, including the layers of sediment and the dating of their remains, suggests that they may have survived until just 12,000 years ago. Some researchers even believe they may have lasted until as recently as 8,000 years ago. That would mean they were still alive when the pyramids were only a dream, when humans were planting the first crops, when the ice age was ending and the seas were beginning to rise. They may have been among the last of the other humans to walk the earth, and then they were gone. Why? No one knows for sure. Some believe modern humans may have reached Flores around that time, bringing new competition, new tools, and perhaps new diseases. Others wonder if natural disasters, such as volcanic eruptions or rising sea levels, played a role. Or perhaps the island, once a shelter, became a trap, a place too small to sustain them when conditions changed. No written words, no art on the walls, just bones, stones, and questions. Even today, the mystery isn't settled. Some scholars debate whether Homo floresiensis was truly a separate species, or just a population of modern humans with a medical condition that stunted their growth. But most agree now that they were something unique, a true human cousin, shaped by forces we are only beginning to understand. And in some corners of Flores, in the forested hills where the sun flickers through the trees, stories still whisper among the elders, tales of small people, shy, quick, clever, who once lived nearby. The locals call them Ibu Gogo, which means grandmother who eats everything. They say these small people would sneak into gardens, steal food, and mimic human speech in strange, garbled tones. Is it myth, memory, or something in between? We may never know for sure, but the bones in Liangbua tell us this: tiny feet once walked this island. They made tools, they hunted, they endured, and they did it all while the rest of the world moved on, unaware that on one little island, the smallest humans were still holding on. Far beneath the surface of the earth, down narrow stone shafts where light doesn't reach and silence settles like dust, a group of ancient humans once laid their dead to rest. Not by accident, not by collapse or coincidence, but with intention, with care. They were called Homo naledi, and for a long time we didn't know they existed at all. Their story began in the dark, literally, inside a South African cave system known as Rising Star. In 2013, two cavers were exploring deep within the twisting passages of this underground maze when they came across something strange: human bones, lots of them, tucked far into a narrow chamber that required crawling, climbing, and squeezing through spaces no wider than a shoebox. It was one of the most difficult archaeological sites ever studied. To even reach the bones, scientists had to recruit a special team of small-bodied researchers who could navigate the tight space. They became known as the underground astronauts. What they uncovered was one of the most extraordinary fossil collections ever found. Over 1,500 pieces of bone from at least 15 individuals, all belonging to a new species of human. They were unlike anything seen before. Homo naledi stood about 5 feet tall, with long legs and curved fingers. Their shoulders were strong and suited for climbing, and their feet were built for walking upright. In some ways, their bodies looked modern, but in other ways, they were ancient. Their skulls were small, much smaller than ours, with brains no bigger than an orange, and yet they were found deep in a cave where no animals had dragged them and where floods and landslides hadn't swept them in. The only way into that chamber was through the same impossibly narrow path the scientists had used, which meant the bodies didn't fall there. They were placed there, one by one, over time, carefully, and that changes everything, because placing the dead in a specific location, especially one so difficult to reach, is not just disposal. It's a choice, a ritual, an act of meaning. But how could a species with such a small brain perform such an act? How could they understand death and what to do with it? Until this discovery, scientists often assumed that burial, the deliberate treatment of the dead, was something only large-brained humans could do. That intelligence came in one shape, one size, that our species, and maybe Neanderthals, were the only ones capable of this kind of thought. Homo naledi shattered that idea. They lived around 300,000 years ago, the same time our own species was just beginning to emerge in Africa, but their brain was only about one-third the size of ours. Still, the evidence shows they returned to that cave, again and again, to place their dead. Some bodies were curled gently, others were grouped together. There were no signs of trauma, no chaos, just quiet placement. It wasn't a tomb filled with treasure. It wasn't dramatic. It was human, and perhaps that's the most haunting part. Not how different they were, but how familiar. One fossil was that of a child, tiny bones, fragile and incomplete. Another was from an elderly adult, worn by age. These weren't just remains, they were lives, carried, lowered, and left with care, deep in the earth. Did they light torches as they climbed down those stone shafts? Did they speak softly to the dead as they said goodbye? Did they cry? We may never know, but in those caves, something powerful happened. Something that leaves fingerprints not on the stone, but in the story of what it means to be human. Because even with a small brain, Homo naledi showed signs of culture, of shared memory, of emotional depth. And maybe that's the lesson they left behind, buried quietly in the dark. That intelligence doesn't only live in size, it lives in connection, in care, in the moment one life says farewell to another. And as we move forward in this story, from these narrow South African caves to other corners of our deep past, Homo naledi reminds us to be cautious with our assumptions, to stay open, to listen for voices that are small and easy to overlook, because sometimes those are the ones with the most to teach us. What separates us from the rest? Is it the shape of our skulls? The way we walk? The size of our brains? Or is it something quieter, something harder to measure? Maybe it's language, the way we turn sound into thought and thought into memory. Maybe it's the way we look back and remember, or the way we look forward and imagine. What makes a human human? It's a question we've been asking since we first looked into the mirror of another's eyes and saw ourselves staring back, and yet still somehow different. Modern humans are storytellers by nature. We name things, we explain things, we draw meaning from silence. We paint on cave walls and call it memory. We place flowers on graves and call it love. But are we the only ones who've done that? As we've moved deeper into the past, into caves, into genomes, into the layered soil of forgotten lives, we've begun to find signs that maybe we weren't so alone in our humanness after all. Take language. It's often called the defining trait of our species, the ability to form complex sentences, to describe what isn't visible, to teach through words rather than gestures. But language doesn't fossilize. We can't dig it out of the ground. We can only look for clues. In Neanderthal skulls, we find the same horseshoe-shaped bone that supports speech in our own throats, the hyoid bone. It's delicate, easily lost to time, but when preserved, it shows a structure nearly identical to ours. Their inner ears, the tiny canals that help us process sound, were shaped in ways that suggest they heard the world much like we do. Their brains, too, had the space needed for language. The Broca's and Wernicke's areas, responsible for processing speech and understanding grammar, were likely present. So did they speak? Maybe not with the same rhythm or range. Maybe not with poetry or politics. But it's hard to imagine a group of Neanderthals hunting mammoth without some way to communicate, to plan, to warn, to celebrate. And if they spoke, even in a simple form, then language is not just ours. What about memory? Not just the kind that recalls where the food is or which cave stays warm through winter, but the kind that holds on to people, the kind that grieves. Neanderthals buried their dead. In some places, they placed them carefully, laid bodies in sleeping positions, sometimes with tools, sometimes with animal bones, possibly with flowers. Was this ritual? Was it spiritual? Or was it simply mourning, the aching need to hold on, even after letting go? And if that's true, then what about symbolism? In the caves of Spain, red and yellow pigments appear on stalactites, marked by Neanderthals at least 64,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens reached that region. Elsewhere, shells were painted and pierced, perhaps strung as necklaces. Tools were carved with care, even decorated. And in one cave, a circle of broken stalagmites was arranged deep underground, suggesting a structure built not for shelter, but for something else, something unseen. And the Denisovans? Though they left behind almost no bones, the artifacts found in Denisova Cave are filled with quiet echoes of intelligence. Polished jewelry, carefully shaped tools. One bracelet made of green stone was drilled using a rotating movement, steady and precise, almost delicate. These aren't the creations of creatures fumbling through survival. These are the marks of minds with patience, with vision, with purpose. So then, if they spoke, if they buried, if they created, why do we hesitate to call them fully human? Perhaps the answer lies not in them, but in us, because we won. And when we win, we write the stories. For a long time, the story of humankind was written like a ladder, with us at the top and everyone else below, forgotten rungs on the way up. We were the thinkers, the dreamers, the artists. They were not, but each discovery tells us otherwise. Each fossil with a healed wound, each painted wall, each stone shaped just so. Maybe the real question isn't whether they were enough like us. Maybe it's whether we're willing to accept that they already were. The truth may be that being human was never about one species. It was never a title we earned alone. It was a shared spark, flickering in different forms, glowing in different corners of the world, passed from hand to hand like fire in the dark. And as we continue our journey through deep time, that spark will keep guiding us, flickering not only in the evidence they left behind, but in the questions they make us ask about ourselves. When you look in the mirror, you see you, your face, your eyes, your familiar reflection. But quietly woven into every cell of your body, there are traces of people you've never met. People long gone, people who once stood in caves, hunted in forests, whispered to each other in forgotten tongues. And though they vanished from the world, part of them still lives in you. We carry them in our blood. For a long time, scientists believed that modern humans and other ancient species, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, were entirely separate, that we replaced them, never mixed with them, that they disappeared, and we inherited the earth alone. But when technology gave us the power to read ancient DNA, the story changed. In 2010, a groundbreaking study revealed something astonishing. Most people alive today carry Neanderthal DNA. Not just a little either. If your ancestors came from Europe, Asia, or the Middle East, somewhere between 1 to 4% of your genome is Neanderthal in origin. That means, no matter how distant, a small part of you is Neanderthal, passed down through thousands of years, across generations, quietly surviving inside the blueprint of your body. That discovery cracked open a new way of seeing ourselves. Neanderthals didn't vanish without a trace. They live on in us, not just as fossils, but as genetic ghosts, whispering through our cells. And their legacy isn't just symbolic, it's functional. Some of the Neanderthal DNA in our bodies affects how our immune systems work, helping us recognize and respond to viruses and bacteria more quickly. Other segments influence how our skin reacts to sunlight, how our hair grows, or even how we experience pain. These aren't dusty relics, they're active parts of who we are. In certain cases, Neanderthal genes have been linked to health conditions like type 2 diabetes, depression, and nicotine addiction. Not all of these effects are helpful, but they tell a deeper story. That evolution didn't stop with the bones, it continued inside us. And the Neanderthals aren't the only ones who left a mark. In parts of Southeast Asia, Oceania, and among indigenous populations in Australia and Papua New Guinea, scientists discovered something else, the genetic fingerprint of another ancient cousin, the Denisovans. Though we've found only scraps of their bones, Denisovans live on through their DNA, and what they left behind is equally remarkable. In Tibetan populations living high in the Himalayas, a specific gene inherited from Denisovans helps people survive the thin air of extreme altitude. It controls how the body uses oxygen, making life at 14,000 feet feel like sea level. Without that ancient adaptation, living in those mountains would be much harder. In other regions, Denisovan DNA plays a role in immune defense, particularly against viruses found in tropical environments. It may have helped early human populations adapt quickly to new climates as they spread across unfamiliar lands. Their contribution was quiet, but essential. They didn't build monuments. They didn't leave cave paintings, but they left behind instructions, small lines of code, like notes in the margin of our genetic book. And these notes are everywhere. They're in the texture of your skin, the curve of your nose, the way your body handles heat, or fights the flu, or processes certain nutrients. They even influence how some people sleep, or how they respond to stress. We often think of extinction as an ending, sharp and final. But in the case of our ancient cousins, it was not clean. It was messy. It was blended. There was conflict, yes, competition, struggle, but there was also connection. And in that connection, something new was born. You. Not a pure species, but a living mosaic, stitched together from ancient lineages, from people who walked different paths, but came together for a moment in time. And though we may not remember their names, though their faces are lost to history, their stories are still unfolding. In our skin, in our blood, in the quiet machinery of life, running beneath everything we do. So the next time you breathe, or laugh, or run your hand through your hair, remember this: you are not only you, you are also everyone who came before. Neanderthal, Denisovan, Sapiens, a blend of all three, still walking, still evolving, still telling a story that began long before you ever opened your eyes. As modern humans spread farther into the world, they didn't find an empty landscape waiting for them. They found neighbors, other humans, ones who had already made a life there. Neanderthals in the forests and hills of Europe, Denisovans in the mountains and valleys of Asia, possibly even Homo erectus in the islands of Indonesia, still holding on, and others perhaps whose names and faces are now completely lost. For a time, these human species coexisted. They walked the same lands, but eventually only one would remain. And that raises a difficult question, one that echoes through the bones and the dirt, but never gives a clear answer. Did we outlive them, or did we push them out? The theory of competition and conflict suggests that as Homo sapiens spread across the globe, they didn't just settle in new places, they competed for them, for food, for shelter, for safety, and for mates. The world wasn't limitless. Even in ancient times, resources could be scarce. The best hunting grounds weren't always shared. The safest caves couldn't house everyone. And when winter came, or game became harder to find, survival meant choosing and defending what mattered most. In several archaeological sites, researchers have found overlapping layers of tools. One layer belongs to Neanderthals, heavy stone scrapers, thick and simple. Then, just above, a layer of more refined blades and points made by Homo sapiens. They often appear in the same regions, sometimes even in the same caves. It tells us something important. These groups weren't separated by continents or centuries. They lived side by side, or at least close enough to breathe the same air, to see each other's fires glowing in the distance, to hear footsteps that didn't belong to their own kind. In France, at a site known as Châtel-Perron, scientists uncovered evidence of this overlap. For a time, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may have used the same region, perhaps even exchanged knowledge or tools, but not forever. Eventually, only one group remained. Some believe this shift happened gradually, a slow replacement as modern humans became more adaptable, more innovative, more connected. But others believe it was more direct, that conflict played a role, and maybe it did. Violence is an uncomfortable part of the human story, but it is part of it. Even today, we fight for space, for resources, for power, and if those instincts run deep in us now, they likely ran deep in our ancestors too. Could early Homo sapiens have seen other human species not as kin, but as rivals, as threats to be driven out? It's possible. In some Neanderthal skeletons, scientists have found fractures in the skull, sharp impacts that could have been made by weapons. Others show signs of being hunted, not by animals, but by other humans. We can't say for sure who delivered those blows. We can't say if it was war or something messier, less organized. But it paints a picture of a world where survival wasn't always peaceful, where fear and hunger may have pushed one species to act against another. Some models even suggest that even a small numerical advantage, just a few more people in each generation, would allow Homo sapiens to slowly overwhelm their cousins. Not in one battle, not in a single event, but over thousands of years. A quiet conquest fueled by larger families, stronger alliances, and more efficient tools. Even mating may have been competitive. If members of one group took mates from another, and their children were raised as part of that dominant group, the genetic legacy of the losing side would slowly fade. Their bodies would vanish from the fossil record, even as parts of their DNA lived on. And so extinction doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it means disappearance, a fading into something else, a vanishing that no one notices until it's too late. Still, there's no single answer. The bones don't speak clearly. The tools don't tell us who threw the first stone. But in the pattern of replacement, in the way Homo sapiens moved in and others moved out, a pattern of competition begins to emerge. One of survival, of dominance, of choice in a world that offered little room for everyone. But as we continue forward in this story, the edges blur again, because not every disappearance came from conflict. There were other forces at work, forces even older than us, colder than rivalry, more relentless than war. And in the next part of our journey, we'll follow those ancient winds to where climates shifted, ice crept in, and the earth itself may have decided who stayed and who didn't, Even without war, even without violence, survival was never easy, because as ancient humans moved across the planet, the earth itself was shifting beneath their feet. Not in days or months, but over centuries and millennia, slow changes that could turn forests into deserts, rivers into ice, and green lands into frozen silence. This wasn't a gentle drift of seasons, it was climate chaos, and for many early human species, it may have been the silent force that pushed them to the edge. During the time when Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others were all alive, the world was caught in a cycle of violent climate swings. Periods of warming would melt the ice, flood valleys, raise sea levels, and shift the rains. Then, almost without warning, the cold would return, swallowing grasslands, pushing glaciers forward, and covering entire regions in snow and silence. It was during one of these colder periods, around 115,000 to 100 years ago, that many of our cousins began to vanish. This stretch of time is known as the last ice age, and it didn't come all at once. It came in waves, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, sometimes in a single lifetime. The world would change so fast that even the animals couldn't keep up, and where the animals went, the people followed, if they could. For early humans, food was everything. Hunting large animals like bison, reindeer, mammoths, and deer provided not just meat, but hides for clothing and bones for tools. But when the climate changed, those animals moved or disappeared. Forests turned to frozen plains. Rain stopped falling. Freshwater lakes dried up. And some hunting grounds that had once teemed with life became empty and still. Those who could move had a chance, but not everyone could. Some species, like Neanderthals, were highly adapted to the cold. Their strong, compact bodies kept in heat, and they were skilled at hunting large ice age prey. But even strength has its limits. When the climate shifted quickly, becoming colder or warmer, wetter or drier, their strategies may have failed them. They relied heavily on specific environments and specific animals, and when those changed, their survival systems may have collapsed. On the other hand, Homo sapiens were different. We were more flexible, more willing to experiment. We ate a wider range of foods, not just big game, but fish, plants, and small animals. We crafted lighter tools, moved in faster groups, and adapted our clothing and shelters to suit changing conditions. And perhaps more importantly, we moved. When the sea rose or the forest vanished, we packed up and searched for something new. We followed rivers. We crossed mountains. We traveled by boat to islands that had never seen another human before. It's possible that this mobility, this refusal to stay still, helped Homo sapiens survive where others couldn't. But for more isolated species, like the Denisovans or the Homo floresiensis, living on distant islands, rising seas were a death sentence. As the Ice Age ended and glaciers melted, sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, drowning coastlines and swallowing land bridges. Islands that had once been connected to the mainland were suddenly cut off. Small populations were trapped. Resources became scarce. New diseases may have emerged in the warm, closed environments. And if those isolated humans couldn't adapt fast enough, or if their numbers fell too low, they may have disappeared quietly, without a trace. And yet, even in the heart of the cold, the earth didn't freeze evenly. Some areas were buried in snow and ice, others became dry and barren, stripped of vegetation. Regions that had once supported whole communities turned to wastelands, while other parts of the world became crowded with people forced to relocate. This unevenness likely caused waves of pressure, pushing species into contact, into competition, and sometimes into collapse. And while climate alone might not have been the only cause of extinction, it likely set the stage. It weakened populations. It cut off access to food and water. It scattered families and shrank the number of safe places to live. And once these human groups were small and struggling, even a minor threat, a new predator, a new disease, or a new rival could have tipped the balance. In many ways, the Earth itself was reshaping the story, not with anger, not with intent, but with ice and wind and time. And as we continued to move and adapt, as Homo sapiens followed the rivers and left footprints across the continents, others faded behind us, not because they failed, but because they were caught in a storm they couldn't outrun. But nature wasn't the only force shaping our past, because even after the cold withdrew, even after the seas calmed and the forests returned, another silent killer still lingered, one we couldn't always see. And in the next chapter of this story, we'll follow its path through breath and blood to understand how even invisible things can leave the deepest scars. Long before antibiotics, before microscopes, before anyone understood what a virus or a germ really was, something invisible began to move through the world. It didn't come with teeth or claws. It didn't strike with a spear or a storm. It moved quietly, from breath to breath, hand to hand, camp to camp, unseen and unstoppable. And it may have helped bring down entire species. As Homo sapiens spread out of Africa and into new lands, we carried more than just tools and fire. We brought something else, something smaller than dust, but far more dangerous. We brought pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites that had evolved alongside us for hundreds of thousands of years. In our bodies, these invaders may have caused illness, fevers, or discomfort, but over time we had built resistance. Our immune systems knew how to fight them, not perfectly, but enough to survive. But when we came into contact with other human species, like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, or others whose names we'll never know, these same microscopic travelers may have found new, defenseless hosts, and that's where the story takes a darker turn, because Neanderthals hadn't evolved alongside the same germs. They had their own immune systems, tuned to the environments of Ice Age Europe and Asia. But when exposed to new diseases carried by modern humans, even something mild, they may have had no protection at all. What might have been a common cold to us could have been deadly to them. It's the same tragic pattern we've seen much later in human history. When European explorers arrived in the Americas, they brought smallpox, measles, and influenza. Within just a few generations, up to 90% of indigenous populations were wiped out, not by war, but by disease. The people who died didn't even know what was killing them. It's possible that something very similar happened thousands of years earlier, during the quiet early meetings between Homo sapiens and the other humans they encountered. There are no fossilized viruses to study, no Neanderthal medical records, but scientists have found hints in our genes, clues hidden in our own immune systems. Some of the Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA that lives inside modern humans today is connected to how our bodies respond to infection. This suggests that when our species mixed through interbreeding and shared life, some of those ancient humans may have passed on valuable immunity genes. But for those who weren't lucky enough to inherit protection, the outcome could have been devastating. The camps would have grown quiet, fires left to burn down, children coughing in the cold, the strong growing weaker, and no one knowing why. And because disease spreads fastest in close contact, it may have hit the most social groups hardest, those who shared food, huddled for warmth, or cared for their sick. Even worse, sickness doesn't just kill directly, it breaks down everything else. Hunting becomes harder, travel becomes riskier, fewer children survive. And slowly, a thriving group can become a fragile one. If a small community lost even a few key members, a skilled hunter, a knowledgeable elder, a nursing mother, the balance could be tipped. And if these losses happen more than once, year after year, the population might never recover. It's a quiet kind of extinction, not with war cries, not with collapse, just fewer people, more silence, until one day the fire goes out for the last time. Some researchers believe this microbial war, not a war we fought, but one fought inside our bodies, may have played a larger role in human history than we ever imagined. And if that's true, it also raises unsettling questions. Did we know we were bringing harm? Did we watch others fall sick and wonder if we were to blame? Or was it all invisible, unfolding beyond anyone's understanding, like a curse no one could name? We can't know for sure, but what we do know is that survival isn't just about strength or tools or intelligence. It's also about biology, about who can withstand the tiniest enemies and who can't. In the end, disease may have been the most powerful weapon in our evolutionary story, one we never meant to use and never fully understood. And even today, its shadow lingers, because in every pandemic, in every outbreak, we are reminded of how vulnerable we still are, and how much of our past may have been shaped not by choice or conflict, but by the invisible breath of something far too small to see. And yet, as powerful as disease may have been, it wasn't the only way ancient humans disappeared, because in some cases, they didn't die at all. They didn't fall to war or weather or sickness. They simply became us. Sometimes extinction doesn't come with a bang. Sometimes it doesn't look like war or hunger or disease. Sometimes it doesn't even feel like an ending. Sometimes it feels like love, like closeness, like skin against skin, or eyes meeting across a fire. It feels like two hands reaching across difference and holding on. And in that moment, something ancient and strange happened. Two different kinds of humans, not the same, but not so different, shared more than territory. They shared life. They shared children, because not all our ancestors vanished in blood and silence. Some of them live on, not in bones or cave paintings, but inside of us. This chapter of the story is not about competition, it's about connection, and the quiet way in which entire species may have dissolved, not through death, but through absorption. Long ago, when Homo sapiens left Africa and spread across the world, we didn't wander into empty lands. We walked into territories already filled with other humans, Neanderthals in the cold forests of Europe, Denisovans in the mountains and caves of Asia. Different faces, different minds, different histories, but all human. And over time, something remarkable happened. We didn't just fight them, we joined them. Modern genetic research has uncovered a powerful truth. Nearly every person alive today, outside of Africa, carries within them a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. 1%, 2%, sometimes more. In certain populations, traces of Denisovan DNA show up as well, especially among peoples from Melanesia, parts of Southeast Asia, and Tibet. These aren't just scientific curiosities, these are whispers of old love stories, proof that our species didn't always meet as enemies. Sometimes we met as partners, as mates, as family. We don't know what those meetings looked like. We don't know the words they spoke, or if they even shared a language at all. But we know what came next. Children, born of two different human species, hybrids carrying both stories in their bones. And those children survived. They passed on their genes. Their descendants thrived. And slowly, slowly, the distinctions between us and them blurred. Not erased, but woven together, strand by strand, until the separate lines became one tangled thread. This is extinction by dissolution, not through violence or disease, but through intimacy. It's a different kind of vanishing. Gentler, perhaps, but still, in the end, a kind of loss. Because even though Neanderthals and Denisovans live on inside our DNA, they are no longer walking the earth. No more new Neanderthal songs, no more Denisovan dreams, only echoes scattered through our blood. Some scientists suggest that interbreeding may have helped Homo sapiens adapt. Perhaps we inherited immunity, or stronger bones, or adaptations for high altitudes. Perhaps it made us more resilient, more suited to survive in foreign lands. But those benefits came at a cost. The other species didn't just mix with us, they were absorbed. Their distinct identities faded. Their unique cultures, if they had them, were lost. Their languages, their myths, their memories all melted into ours. And maybe that's what makes this part of the story so achingly human, because even when we didn't destroy, we still replaced. We still watched the others disappear, not with a scream, but with a whisper. And perhaps the deepest question of all is this: what does it mean to survive if it means becoming someone else? Did those who mingled with us choose it freely, or were they outnumbered, outpaced, drawn into something they couldn't stop? Did they know their kind would vanish in the process? We'll never know for sure. But when we look in the mirror today, when we see the shape of our cheekbones, the curve of our fingers, the way we breathe at high altitudes, or fight off infections, we carry the answer. We are a mosaic, a memory of ancient unions, a story written in shared blood. And even if we can't hear their voices anymore, even if their faces have vanished from the world, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and others like them are still with us, in every heartbeat, in every breath. And that, in a way, is its own kind of immortality. Something changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It didn't come with thunder or fire. But around 70,000 years ago, something began to stir in the minds of Homo sapiens. Something quiet, but utterly world-shifting. A new way of thinking. At first glance, it might have looked the same. People still hunted, still gathered food, still made tools from stone and bone. But behind their eyes, the world was beginning to open in a different way. Thoughts became deeper, imagination grew stronger, and for the first time, humans were able to think beyond the moment. This mysterious shift, this leap in awareness, is what many scientists now call the cognitive revolution. Before this, early humans, including sapiens, were clever. They knew how to survive. They could make fire, shape tools, even form tight-knit communities. But something about their thinking was still rooted in the concrete, in the now. And then something clicked. Maybe it was a subtle change in the structure of the brain. Maybe a small genetic mutation quietly rewired the way thoughts were processed. Whatever the cause, Homo sapiens suddenly began to see what wasn't there. They began to imagine, not just things they could touch, but things they couldn't: stories, symbols, futures, fears, gods. This was the dawn of abstract thought, the moment when imagination lifted humans beyond instinct into something new. We started carving patterns into stone, painting animals on cave walls with ochre and charcoal. These weren't just decorations, they were symbols, signs of a mind that could dream and share those dreams with others. A deer painted on a wall might have meant more than just food. It could represent the spirit of the animal, or the memory of a hunt, or a prayer whispered into pigment and rock. Around campfires, voices may have carried stories, passed down from grandmother to grandchild. Stories that weren't just about what was, but what could be. Myths of origins, of monsters, of meaning. And in that storytelling, something precious was born: culture. Humans began to do more than just survive. They began to shape their world, not just with hands, but with ideas. Tools became more specialized, more refined. Needles made from bone for stitching clothes, hooks for fishing, spears tipped with stone that had been carefully flaked and balanced. These weren't the crude tools of instinct. They were the deliberate creations of a thinking mind, a strategic one. Homo sapiens began working together in more complex ways, too. Cooperation grew more sophisticated. People planned, coordinated, shared ideas. They could imagine future outcomes, successes, dangers, opportunities, and act accordingly. This wasn't just intelligence, it was foresight. And once that door was open, nothing was the same again. With language more advanced than ever before, information could travel farther and faster. A good idea didn't die with one person. It could live on, evolve, spread. Knowledge could stack, innovation could snowball. From generation to generation, the pace of progress quickened. Homo sapiens began leaving behind not just footprints but legacies, tiny burial beads shaped from shells, carvings of animals never seen in the wild, creatures that lived only in the mind. The earliest maps drawn in sand or scratched into stone. These were not acts of survival, but acts of imagination. It's likely that not all human species went through this same revolution in the same way. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others were intelligent. We know they made tools, buried their dead, and may have even created symbolic objects. But Homo sapiens developed a kind of mental flexibility that seemed to tip the scales. We could adapt faster, think further, coordinate better, and perhaps most importantly, we could believe. Believe in things that weren't visible, invisible bonds like gods, laws, kinship, currency, loyalty. These ideas gave us the power to organize in massive numbers, to trust strangers, to build societies that would someday stretch across continents. The cognitive revolution wasn't a single event, it was a slow blooming, a shift that may have taken thousands of years, unfolding in whispers, not shouts, but it changed everything. And from that moment forward, Homo sapiens were no longer just animals surviving in a dangerous world. We became something else, dreamers, builders, believers, and that new way of thinking would shape the rest of human history. They could point, gesture, grunt, just like others. But then came something more. Somewhere in the long, quiet history of our kind, the air between us began to change. Not just with noise, but with meaning. Mouths shaped sounds that painted ideas. Those ideas traveled from one mind to another, unseen but understood. And suddenly, we weren't just surviving. We were communicating. Language didn't arrive all at once. It wasn't a thunderclap. It grew slowly, syllable by syllable, through generations of shared need, the need to warn, to request, to describe, to remember. At first, it may have been simple, sounds for danger, food, or direction, but with each passing century, those sounds deepened. They gained structure, grammar, rhythm. They became songs and stories, commands and questions, and with them came a power no other creature on earth had ever known, the ability to think together. Other species, like Neanderthals, likely had forms of communication. They may have had names, signals, maybe even some symbols, but something about Homo sapiens' use of language allowed for more than just expression. It allowed for coordination. With words, groups could plan a hunt before ever lifting a spear. They could divide roles, signal strategies, share what they'd seen days before, a mammoth trail, a cave, a storm on the horizon. Language let them simulate the future, rehearse it out loud, then make it real. And when danger struck, speech moved faster than motion. A single whispered warning could ripple through the group like wind through grass, silent, efficient, life-saving. But language wasn't just for survival, it was also a tool for manipulation. With speech came the possibility of persuasion, to argue, to comfort, to deceive. One human could alter the behavior of another, using only the power of breath and sound. A promise could be made or broken. A lie could shape an entire group's next move. And yet, it was that same tool that allowed truth to be passed on, the truth of experience, of memory, of knowledge. Around fires, elders shared more than warmth. They passed down lessons from hunts long past, taught names for plants, for stars, for gods. The voice of a grandmother could carry the memories of her grandmother and her grandmother before that. Wisdom didn't have to die with the body, it could live on in words. This changed everything. Where other human species had to learn by doing, watching, copying, trying, Homo sapiens could learn by listening. A child could know the danger of a cliff, the taste of a poisonous root, or the shape of the seasons before ever stepping outside the safety of the camp. Language allowed time itself to stretch. Ideas could now move forward, beyond the moment, into futures not yet lived. And they could also reach backward, anchoring each new generation to the ones before. But this superpower wasn't just practical, it was emotional. With words, we could say, I love you before death. We could name grief. We could give shape to longing. No longer did feelings stay trapped behind the eyes. They could be shared, held, remembered. And as language evolved, so did imagination. Words gave rise to metaphors. A river could be a vein. The moon could be a mother. A shadow could mean fear. With every new phrase, the human mind opened wider. The invisible became real. Entire belief systems were born from this ability. Religion, law, kinship. These were not tangible things, not like trees or stones, but through language they became real enough to follow. With shared stories, humans could belong to something greater than themselves, a clan, a tribe, a purpose. No longer bound by blood alone, we could now form imagined communities, groups united by common symbols, songs, ancestors, or goals, and those communities, they could grow. Two people who had never met could still trust one another because of a shared word, a shared story, or a shared belief. Language built bridges between strangers. That trust, that connection, allowed for groups larger than anything ever seen before. From wandering families to villages, from villages to cities, from cities to civilizations, all of it, sparked by the quiet magic of sound, turned into meaning, and that magic still lives in us now. Every lullaby whispered to a child, every poem written in heartbreak, every bedtime story passed from parent to child. They all echo back to that first moment, thousands of years ago, when one human looked at another and shaped a sound into a thought. And for the first time in history, that thought was shared. It began with a flicker. Maybe it was lightning that split a tree in half, or the slow, steady burn of dry grass under the sun. However it started, one day our ancestors stopped running from the flames and began to gather around them. At first, fire must have been terrifying, a wild, hungry thing, but once tamed, it became something else entirely. A quiet revolution, a silent turning point that would reshape not just our survival, but our minds. Because fire didn't just warm the cold or scare away predators, it transformed what we ate. Until that point, chewing raw meat and fibrous roots was a time-consuming, energy-draining task, a jaw-straining, gut-burdening effort that filled the belly but left little fuel for anything else. But cooked food changed the rules. When our ancestors first placed meat on the fire, they unlocked more than just flavor. Heat broke down tough fibers, killed harmful microbes, and made calories easier to access. Suddenly, the body didn't have to work so hard to digest. That freed up energy, energy that once fed bulky stomachs, now had somewhere else to go. It went to the brain, because brains, as brilliant as they are also greedy. They burn through vast amounts of energy just to think, to remember, to wonder, and before cooking, that kind of mental luxury was rare. But as meals became more efficient, the door opened for something extraordinary. Our brains began to grow. Slowly, generation by generation, the human brain expanded, especially in regions tied to planning, memory, and language. Cooking didn't just make food softer, it made thinking deeper. But the gift of fire didn't end at dinner. Fire changed the night. Before flame, when the sun set, so did the day. Darkness wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Predators lurked. Vision vanished, and with it, so did connection. But with the fire burning, the night became something else. It became time for stories. Around that orange glow, voices began to rise, not in warning, but in wonder. Hunters recounted close calls, elders passed down memories, children listened wide eyed to tales of spirits, ancestors, or lessons hidden in the stars. These weren't just idle conversations, they were the birth of culture. Language, memory, curiosity, they all deepened here by the crackling wood. Patterns of speech were repeated, rituals were formed, bonds were strengthened. The flames didn't just warm bodies, they knit hearts together. And it was here that imagination took root. The firelight danced against cave walls, casting shadows that looked like monsters, gods, or dreams. Perhaps someone began to wonder, what if the shadows were more than shadows? What if stories could explain them? So, around these fires, our ancestors didn't just survive the night, they filled it with meaning, and with that meaning came time. Time to think, reflect, and prepare. Fire gave people the ability to pause, to plan not just the next hunt, but the next life. They weren't reacting anymore, they were anticipating. In those extra hours of light, something quietly awakened. Consciousness stretched, futures were imagined, pasts were remembered. People began to draw on rocks, etch shapes into bones, perhaps even sing, all because there was time, warmth, and safety to do so. Even relationships began to evolve in the light of fire. With danger kept at bay, humans could spend more time with each other. They sat closer, they looked into each other's eyes, they connected. From warmth came affection, from shared meals, trust, from stories, identity. And that identity, that sense of being part of a group, of something larger than the self, created the foundations of what would later become tribes, communities, and civilizations, all from fire, a tool, a ritual, a turning point. And maybe, even now, when we gather around flickering light, whether a campfire or a candle, we feel that same ancient rhythm stirring, that same hush of wonder, that same instinct to listen, to tell, to be human, because in the heart of the fire, something essential still burns. There's something timeless about the stroke of a hand across stone. Deep in the dark of ancient caves, places so silent you can hear your own breath, there are still echoes of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago. Not in bones, not in tools, but in paint, handprints, red ochre spirals, herds of animals drawn in sweeping, confident lines. They cover the walls like whispers from another world, one that existed over 40,000 years ago. These early humans didn't just survive, they expressed. And this moment, the creation of art, marks something extraordinary, a line between instinct and imagination, between doing and meaning. To draw something that isn't there, that's not immediate or necessary, requires something else entirely. It asks for memory, for imagination, for symbolic thinking, the kind of thought that says, this shape represents that animal, this mark stands for that feeling, this place is sacred. The earliest cave art we've found appears in places like Cheve in France, Sulawesi in Indonesia, and El Castillo in Spain. In some caves, the walls are covered in outlines of hands, like someone pressed their palm to the stone, blew pigment around it, and left behind a ghost. A sign, I was here. Others drew stags, lions, mammoths, and rhinos. Not crudely, not without grace, but with motion, tension, and feeling. These animals weren't just food, they were stories, spirits, symbols. They lived in the mind as well as the forest. And somewhere in those shadows, something began to awaken. Perhaps the first flickers of spirituality were born not from fear, but from wonder, from the awe of watching a starry sky, from the ache of losing someone, from the rhythm of birth and death, and everything in between. To make art is to wonder if there's something more. But here's where things get even more haunting. It wasn't just Homo sapiens who may have made art. In a cave in Spain, a series of red pigment markings were found, dating back more than 65,000 years. That's long before modern humans arrived there. The only ones present at the time were Neanderthals. Other caves show deliberate arrangements of stalagmites, possibly by Neanderthals as well. Were these rituals, decorations, altars? We may never fully know, but the lines between us and them begin to blur. If Neanderthals painted, carved, arranged, then they too may have had inner lives rich with meaning. They too may have remembered the dead, celebrated the seasons, told stories in gesture, rhythm, and pigment. The old idea that creativity belonged only to us begins to crumble, because even in the bones of Homo naledi, we found signs of deliberate placement, a kind of burial. And the Denisovans, though known mostly through DNA, lived in the same cave where sophisticated tools and beads were uncovered. So maybe it wasn't just one species who could dream. Maybe the birth of symbols was not a sudden lightning strike, but a slow burning fire across many branches of our human family. A shared flicker, a common thread. And that thread is still in us. Because today, we still paint, we still write, we still light candles, and look up at the stars and ask the very same questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? And what comes next? Even now, children leave handprints on walls. Artists sketch animals with motion and soul. We mark graves. We sing to the sky. We tell stories to make sense of the world, just as they did. These early artworks, pressed into stone and shadow, aren't just beautiful, they're evidence of a heartbeat, one that echoes across time. And when we stand in those ancient caves, flashlight trembling on the wall, looking at the fingerprint of someone who lived 40,000 years ago, it's hard not to feel something stir inside, a connection, a question, a memory we never made, but somehow still recognize. Because symbols are bridges, and art is proof that we were always trying to cross them. Somewhere in the icy dusk of a Paleolithic evening, a figure kneels by the flickering firelight, in their hands a tool unlike any that came before. It's not just a stone, it's not just a stick, it's a carefully assembled creation, stone, bone, wood, and sinew, each chosen with intent, each piece fitted together to become something more than the sum of its parts, a spear shaped by thought, reinforced by instinct, built by memory. And in that quiet moment, as sparks leap into the cold air, another quiet revolution unfolds. Because survival, in the world of early humans, wasn't just about strength. It wasn't just about brute force or big brains. It was about speed, not how fast you could run, but how quickly you could adapt. Homo sapiens were not the first to use tools. Other human species, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, even earlier ancestors, all crafted implements for hunting, scraping, cutting. But something shifted in our lineage. We began to combine ideas. Instead of using a sharpened rock alone, we lashed it to a handle. Instead of relying on raw instinct, we began to plan ahead, creating complex tools that took multiple steps to make. This process, called composite toolmaking, required more than skill. It needed imagination, coordination, and the ability to visualize something before it existed. These tools weren't just sharper or stronger, they were smarter. With each generation, improvements came faster, spears became lighter and flew farther. Needles carved delicately from bone were used to stitch hides together, not just for covering, but for tailored clothing that protected against cold, wind, and rain. It's easy to overlook the power of something as simple as a coat, but in an Ice Age world, it was a kind of armor. While other human species may have relied on huddling near fire or wearing unshaped hides, Homo sapiens began to customize, to cut, to fit, to create outfits for infants, for elders, for hunters and gatherers alike. And these weren't just practical, some were decorated shell beads, ochre stains, intricate patterns carved into bone, signs not only of functionality, but of identity. Clothing became a way to express belonging, rank, or belief. And when we moved, as we often did, we brought these innovations with us. As climate shifted, animals migrated, and forests gave way to frozen tundras, Homo sapiens showed a startling ability to adjust. Not over thousands of years, but within generations, new hunting strategies emerged: traps, nets, drives, and ambushes. We learned to read animal behavior, to anticipate, to collaborate. This flexibility became one of our greatest survival tools. In regions where big game was scarce, we adapted to hunt small animals or fish. In dense forests, we learned to move quietly, using lighter spears and better camouflage. On wide, windy plains, we perfected long-range throwing tools, like the atlatl, a kind of spear thrower that gave even small-framed hunters the power to strike at a distance. Wherever we went, we observed, we learned, and we evolved, not biologically, but culturally. Each new environment became a kind of test. And rather than waiting for natural selection to catch up, we built the answers ourselves. This accelerated innovation wasn't magic. It came from minds trained to remember and refine, from communities that passed knowledge from generation to generation, not just through imitation, but through language and teaching. A child could grow up surrounded by tools, listening to stories of hunts and triumphs, watching their elders twist cordage or shape flint. By the time they held a blade of their own, they already knew the mistakes to avoid, the best materials, the secret angles. This intergenerational intelligence allowed technology to snowball. Other species, even those who made tools, seemed to improve more slowly. They refined what worked, but rarely broke away from tradition. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, were restless, curious, willing to experiment. Even failure became a kind of teacher. And over time, this restlessness paid off. We crafted boats to cross rivers and oceans. We built shelters that withstood storms. We shaped the environment to suit us, not the other way around. In this way, innovation became survival, and survival became storytelling. Because every tool held a lesson, every stitched seam carried a memory, every clever idea passed from one hand to another was a thread in the tapestry of human resilience, and those threads still run through us today. From the clothing on your back to the device in your hand, you are surrounded by echoes of that ancient creativity, the sparks that lit fires in cold nights, the edge that carved through the unknown. And somewhere far back in the darkness of time, a figure kneels beside the fire, tying stone to wood, shaping the future. One tool, one idea, one leap at a time. Far away from the cave paintings and fireside tools, in the wide open spaces where grass bends in the wind and rivers carve deep into the earth, something quiet and extraordinary began to unfold. A hand reached out, and another hand, from far beyond the horizon, reached back. They didn't speak the same language, they didn't look exactly alike, but between them, an object passed. Maybe it was a piece of amber, still warm with the scent of ancient trees, or a sharp black flake of obsidian, gleaming like night. Or maybe it was something softer, a shell smoothed by the ocean, carried hundreds of miles inland where the sea had never touched. Whatever it was, it meant something, because in the world of early Homo sapiens, survival wasn't just about strength or tools or even language, it was about connection. Long before cities, before writing, before metal or money, people were already trading, not just things, but stories, ideas, and knowledge. These exchanges stretched farther than we once imagined, sometimes hundreds of miles, linking groups across mountains, forests, and deserts. We know this not from myths, but from the objects themselves. Beads made of seashells have been found in deserts. Volcanic glass, traceable to specific eruptions, has been uncovered far from any volcano. Pigments, stones, and ornaments appear in places where they do not naturally occur. These weren't random wanderers dropping things by accident. This was part of something organized, something intentional. It speaks of social networks, not the kind we tap with our thumbs today, but the kind woven across generations and geographies. Groups of humans who met, bartered, shared, and sometimes intermarried. They didn't just survive, they relied on each other. If one region suffered drought, another might still have water. If one group's hunt failed, another might share their meat. These weren't just transactions, they were lifelines, and they created resilience, because in a world ruled by chaos, shifting climates, dangerous predators, sudden sickness, isolation was risky. But cooperation was insurance. These long-distance ties allowed ideas to spread more quickly, too. A new way to stitch leather, a better way to shape a blade, a pigment that made cave walls glow red in firelight. These innovations didn't have to be invented over and over again. They could travel. And so the network grew. We can imagine it now, paths crisscrossing the landscape like invisible threads, people walking for days, even weeks to visit distant cousins, to exchange goods and gossip and gifts, to maintain the bonds that stitch their fragile world together. And this may be where Homo sapiens gained yet another quiet edge. Because when we look at the archaeological record of other human species, especially the Neanderthals, we see something different. Yes, they made tools. Yes, they hunted in groups and even buried their dead. But the signs of long-range exchange, of material moving across vast landscapes, are far more limited. Their groups seemed smaller, more self-contained. The tools they used varied less across distance, suggesting that ideas may not have spread as widely or as quickly. It's possible their social world was simply more localized, family bands staying near familiar grounds without the same degree of cross-group interaction, and in times of plenty, that may have worked. But when the climate turned colder, or prey moved on, or disease struck, a group that stood alone might simply vanish, whereas those connected through a web of trust, trade, and shared memory could adapt, could call for help, could move in and out of alliances that softened the blows of a harsh and unpredictable world. It wasn't just the things they exchanged, it was the relationships. Even today, when you hold something passed down from a grandparent, or wear a ring given by a friend, or treasure a gift brought back from far away, you are holding a symbol of connection. And in those early networks, those slow and sacred trades across the land, our ancestors were building something more than economy. They were building a civilization of empathy. One obsidian flake, one seashell bead, one step at a time. In a quiet clearing, Just past the glow of a campfire, a child sits cross legged in the dirt, listening with wide eyes. The night hums with insect songs and the gentle crackle of flame. Across from the child, an elder leans forward, face weathered, voice low, speaking not just to the little one, but to the future. This scene, so simple, has echoed for tens of thousands of years, because survival in the human story was never just about tools or trade. It was about teaching, about passing knowledge down, not through books or recordings, but through people. And the ones who made that possible were the children and the elders. Among all the species on Earth, humans are unusual in one remarkable way. We have very long childhoods. For years, human children depend completely on others. They aren't born ready to run or hunt or forage. Instead, they come into the world fragile and hungry for learning. That slow start is not a weakness, it's a superpower, because with time comes room for growth, space for curiosity. The brain of a young child is like soft clay, open to shaping, eager to absorb every gesture, word, and rhythm around them. They watch how their mother weaves fiber, how their father sharpens stone, how their siblings laugh and solve problems and soothe wounds. They play, not aimlessly, but as a rehearsal for life. Through pretend games, imitation, and storytelling, children build the cognitive scaffolding for everything that follows: language, memory, cooperation, and empathy. And the reason they can afford to grow so slowly is because someone is there to guide them, not just parents, but grandparents, great uncles, older siblings, those who came before. In many early human groups, elders weren't cast aside, they were treasured. Their backs may have bent, their steps slowed, but inside them burned a library of memory. They had seen the river flood and retreat. They remembered when the reindeer came early one year, and when the bitter roots cured the sickness that swept through the camp. They had stories of hunger and survival, of strange animals, of dangerous places and sacred ones, and in their stories lived the wisdom of the tribe. These elders weren't just passive rememberers, they were teachers, guardians, and sometimes healers. They taught songs and rituals, explained signs in the stars, and named each plant not just by how it looked, but by what it meant. And they had time to sit with the little ones, to show them, again and again, how to tie a knot or strike a spark. Time to tell a story just because it was beautiful, or scary, or funny. Time to answer the questions that spilled from curious mouths like river water. In this way, a long childhood became a kind of bridge, one that stretched across generations, and the elders were the ones who held the bridge steady. Even today, in societies that rely on oral tradition, the elders are often called the living libraries. And it's no coincidence that cultures with strong oral histories often have deep respect for both the oldest and youngest among them. Archaeological hints suggest that this was true even tens of thousands of years ago. Burials of the elderly show care, sometimes with tools, beads, or ochre beside them. The placement wasn't random. It suggests that they were honored, perhaps even mourned as leaders or storytellers. And the bones of young children, too, are found carefully laid to rest, which means they were loved and seen as more than just dependents. They were seen as essential to the group's identity. In multi-generational groups, everyone had a role. The strong hunted, the clever crafted, the mothers nursed, and the elders remembered. They remembered the stories, the songs, the sacred paths through the mountains, and in doing so, they gave the children more than survival skills. They gave them a sense of belonging. A child raised by many hands, with many voices whispering guidance, does not just learn how to survive, they learn who they are. And in that identity, they carry the group forward. So when we ask why Homo sapiens outlasted their cousins, We may need to look not just at tools or trade or DNA, but at the soft, slow rhythms of childhood and the quiet wisdom of old age. Because somewhere around a fire, a little hand reached for an elder's, and a story began. And now, with that story still whispering in our blood, we follow the trail to the last days of our ancient cousins, and how we trace their fading footsteps in caves and valleys even now. Something shifted. Roughly 50,000 years ago, a quiet change began to ripple through the human world. Not a sudden bang or a single invention, but a subtle tipping of balance. Like the wind changing direction just before a great storm, this shift was invisible at first, but soon it would reshape the entire human story. Anthropologists call it the Great Leap Forward, a time when something inside Homo sapiens, something in the way we saw the world, or communicated, or imagined, took a dramatic turn, and the signs are scattered all across the earth like breadcrumbs. Before this moment, humans had already existed for hundreds of thousands of years. We made tools, we survived cold winters, we painted on cave walls and followed herds across grasslands. But after this leap, everything began to accelerate. Suddenly, migration patterns burst outward like veins from a heart. Homo sapiens began moving quickly, far and wide. Within a few thousand years, our footprints spread across massive swaths of territory, from Africa to the Middle East, then across Europe, deep into Asia, down into the islands of Southeast Asia, and eventually somehow to the vast and empty continent of Australia. Each journey was a feat of planning, courage, and cooperation. These weren't just slow, aimless wanderings. Evidence suggests that these ancient travelers brought with them tools, fire-making knowledge, food supplies, and perhaps most importantly, a shared understanding. Something had changed in how we worked together, how we passed information, how we adapted to challenges on the move. In a time when the world was raw and unpredictable, we became navigators, not just of rivers and stars, but of uncertainty. Across Europe, the spread of Homo sapiens coincided with a fading presence of Neanderthals, where once they had dominated the cold forests and rocky caves, now they seemed to retreat, little by little, until their last known traces disappeared. In Asia, the Denisovans too began to vanish. We know so little about them, no faces, just fragments of their story etched into our DNA. But the timing, the pattern, it matches. Wherever Homo sapiens expanded, other kinds of humans began to disappear. It's as though a tide had risen, quiet and unstoppable, and once it reached a certain height, it washed away everything in its path. Why did this happen? Some scientists think it wasn't one thing, but a cascade, a moment when a combination of factors, sharper tools, better cooperation, wider trade, and the rise of language and art gave our species an edge so subtle it went unnoticed until it was too late. Others believe the key difference was in how we imagined possibilities. After this leap, we began to shape the world around us with new intensity. We carved new tools from bone, combining different materials, stone blades with wooden shafts, animal sinew for string. We fished, we sewed, we painted, we buried our dead with meaning. We made figurines and pendants, perhaps carried as symbols. We tamed fire in new ways, gathering late into the night to share stories that shaped how we understood our place in the world. We didn't just respond to the environment anymore, we changed it, and that kind of creativity is hard to compete with. Still, it wasn't a war, at least not in the traditional sense. There are no battlefields, no mass graves of enemy lines, no stone spears embedded in Neanderthal skulls that tell of a grand campaign. If violence occurred, it may have been isolated, skirmishes between groups that barely understood each other. Instead, the erasure of other humans might have been quieter, slower, an unintended consequence of one species growing and the others not keeping up. As Homo sapiens moved into new lands, we may have outnumbered the locals, used resources more efficiently, formed larger, more complex groups that could handle drought, cold, and hunger better than those around us. And perhaps at times we absorbed them too, not through force but through love, companionship, and shared children, tiny genetic threads that now whisper through our blood, carrying the voices of Neanderthals and Denisovans into the future. But even then, the silence deepened. By 40,000 years ago, nearly every other kind of human had vanished. Not just gone, but forgotten. No cities were left behind. No scrolls, no monuments, just bones, tools, paintings on cave walls. DNA nestled in the corners of our genome. A whole cast of human relatives vanished within a few thousand years of our rise. And it all traces back to this one moment, the tipping point, when our ancestors looked out into the night, saw more than just stars, and dreamed of new places to go. From here, the story doesn't slow down. If anything, it gathers speed, because once the last of our cousins faded from the earth, we were truly alone, and in that loneliness, we built the world. They saw each other, not just across time, through bones and genomes, but truly face to face, on the edge of a forest, in the mouth of a cave, along a riverbank where mammoths once drank. There were moments, long ago, when different kinds of humans locked eyes and didn't yet know they were different. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens. For tens of thousands of years, their footprints overlapped. We can see the shadows of these encounters in the soil beneath our feet, layers of ash and stone tools built atop one another. Archaeological sites in places like Shanidar Cave in Iraq or the famous Grotte du Rhin in France hold clues like time capsules sealed in silence. A hearth once used by Neanderthals, later filled with tools unmistakably made by Homo sapiens, or a stone blade carved in the unique shape preferred by our species, buried beneath the remains of Neanderthal ornaments, pendants, pierced teeth, rings. These were not far off neighbors. They shared the same cold winds. They hunted the same prey. They drank from the same melting streams after winter. And sometimes they may have shared more than that. In parts of Europe and the Middle East, their timelines converged for thousands of years. This wasn't a brief collision, it was a slow, tangled dance across generations, a messy, complex coexistence that raises one haunting question. What happened when we met? Did we see them as kin? Did they see us as rivals? Did we trade flint or meat or stories around fires that no longer burn? Or did we stare across distance with caution, like two wolves unsure of a shared territory? The truth may be all of it. Some encounters may have been warm, two groups meeting during migration, one offering fire, the other offering food. Perhaps a Neanderthal child played with a sapiens child, and no one thought it strange. Perhaps a sapiens woman tended a Denisovan wound. We'll never know the exact words they spoke, but the genetic evidence tells us that mating occurred, that love or something like it crossed species lines. There are signs, too, that trade may have flowed between groups. The movement of tools and materials across great distances suggest communication networks more intricate than we once believed. Ochre pigments, shells, bone needles, carried across hundreds of miles, passed hand to hand, from people who had no map but followed the stars, the winds, and each other. But the story wasn't always peaceful. Some tool layers seem abruptly replaced, as if one group suddenly vanished and another took their place. Sites once rich in Neanderthal activity go silent, only to be filled later by Homo sapiens settlements. It's tempting to imagine conquest, but perhaps the truth was quieter, a slow pushing out. One group better at surviving drought, another more efficient at hunting. Subtle differences with massive consequences over time. There may have been skirmishes, tension over water, over land, over game. We see it in modern humans, the friction between groups who speak differently, move differently, think differently. Imagine meeting someone who looks almost like you, but not quite, who gestures in strange ways, who sings in unfamiliar tones. Would you be curious, afraid, enchanted? There is one particular site in France, the Chateau-Perronian culture, where Neanderthals appear to have used tools and ornaments previously only associated with Homo sapiens. Necklaces, carved bone points. Was this imitation, inspiration, or the result of blended families, where knowledge passed through marriage and proximity? In the Altai Mountains of Siberia, inside a cold, dark cave, archaeologists found the remains of a girl. Her DNA revealed something astonishing. She was the child of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. Their worlds weren't just colliding, they were intertwining, and in the genetic echoes passed down through us, we feel the residue of these long ago meetings. Not all humans disappeared in death. Some disappeared into us. Still, for all the layers of stone and genes we uncover, there is so much we don't know. No diaries, no carved record of what it felt like to meet someone almost like you, but not quite. Just silence, ash, and questions that hover in the air like ghosts around a campfire. As one group began to rise and the others to fade, the earth shifted. But before that shift became permanent, there were moments when the branches of the human tree reached out and touched. And just beyond the next bend in this ancient trail, we begin to understand what it really meant to be alone. In the quiet shadows of history, there's a question we rarely ask aloud. What if we didn't just outlast our ancient cousins? What if we erased them? It's an unsettling thought, not because we know it to be true, but because we can't rule it out. Beneath the ashes of long extinct campsites, beneath the tools and bones and broken teeth, some archaeologists whisper theories that sit heavy on the heart. Maybe extinction wasn't always silent. Maybe in some places it was loud. We know that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals overlapped in parts of Europe for thousands of years, that our ancestors and the Denisovans crossed paths in Asia, that we weren't isolated species orbiting different parts of the world. We walked the same paths, drank from the same rivers, and hunted under the same sky, and yet it's only one lineage that made it to today. The fossil record doesn't scream violence. There are no mass graves lined with weapons, no murals of war, but bones rarely tell us everything. Time swallows the softest truths first, and if there were moments of bloodshed, ambushes in the dark, raids on sleeping camps, battles over territory, they may have vanished like breath on a cold morning. There are hints, though, subtle ones. In certain regions, Neanderthal presence drops off quickly and permanently after Homo sapiens arrive. At some sites, layers of Neanderthal artifacts are followed directly and suddenly by those of our species. No overlap, no blending, just silence, and then someone else. It's not definitive, but it's suggestive, and it opens a door to a much harder question, not just what we did, but who we were. Were we capable of seeing those who looked almost like us and choosing to eliminate them? We don't want to believe it. But even today, humans often struggle to treat other humans with compassion, especially when they look different, speak differently, or seem to belong to an other group. If modern humans can wage war over language, over belief, over skin tone, what might early humans have done when faced with a rival species? A species that looked human, but not quite. that may have smelled different, moved differently, sounded unfamiliar? Did fear turn to hostility? It's a question that lingers not just in archaeology, but in philosophy. Because if we did erase our cousins, even just in part, what does that say about us? Is it something we buried deep in our bones, a legacy of survival at any cost? Or was it an accident of desperation, conflict born of scarcity? Imagine a brutal winter. Food is vanishing. A small tribe clings to life in the forest, and just beyond the ridge, another group, bigger, stronger, competing for the same prey. Do you make peace? Do you share what little you have? Or do you sharpen your spears? These aren't just ancient scenarios, they echo in every corner of our modern world. In times of crisis, humans have often drawn hard lines between us and them. We've seen it in border disputes, in genocides, in the way history gets written by those who remain. Maybe our past is no different. Some scientists argue that Homo sapiens had a cognitive edge, not just in intelligence, but in cooperation, in uniting across tribes, in organizing for a common cause. If that cause in some places was expansion, then what stood in the way may have been wiped out, not by nature, but by design. Not everywhere, not always, but perhaps, sometimes. And if even a sliver of that is true, it means the story of human success isn't just one of brilliance and resilience, it may also be one of blood. But then again, absence doesn't equal murder. These theories remain controversial because the evidence is thin. What we're left with is a haunting ambiguity, a possibility. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the deepest lesson isn't just about what happened, it's about what could have happened, about the shadows that follow us, not only from behind, but within. As we move forward, unearthing the bones of those who came before, we're not just studying them, we're studying ourselves, our nature, our choices. And when we look into the hollow eyes of a Neanderthal skull, or brush the dirt from a Denisovan tool, we're not just finding the past, we're finding a mirror, one that doesn't always show us what we want to see. If you listen closely, history doesn't always speak in shouts. Sometimes it whispers. Not all of our cousins vanished at once. Their lights didn't all flicker out in a single dramatic moment. Some held on, stubbornly, bravely, in the farthest edges of the map, quiet corners tucked away from the march of change. And in those places, the last of them lingered as the world around them shifted, shrank, and slipped beyond their grasp. Let's begin in Gibraltar, not the bustling, sun-drenched Gibraltar of today, but a colder, wilder one, 40,000 years ago, jagged cliffs rising above crashing waves, wind curling into dark sea-facing caves. In these sheltered places, signs of life remained, charred bones, flint tools, a faint breath of warmth still clinging to the stone. This wasn't just a campsite, it was a sanctuary. Here, at the southernmost edge of Europe, the Neanderthals made their final stand. Isolated from the spreading tide of Homo sapiens to the north, they held on to life in the only way they could, by staying hidden, by adapting to the sea. They fished, they foraged, they watched the horizon, and perhaps they waited. But time is unkind to those stranded at the edge. The climate was turning colder and drier. Animals they once hunted disappeared. Forests withered into scrubland. Rain came less often. The land itself seemed to grow tired, and slowly the Neanderthals disappeared. Not with a cry, but with a long, aching silence. We don't know who the last Neanderthal was. We don't know if they died alone, but we do know they existed. Long after their kind had vanished elsewhere, someone was still breathing, still walking, still human in the caves of Gibraltar. Far across the world, another group held fast, high in the mountains, beyond the reach of lowland winds, the Denisovans. They remain the most mysterious of our ancient relatives, shadowy figures glimpsed more through genetics than bone, and yet from the traces we've found, we know they were not easily erased. In the cold caves of Siberia, in places like Denisova Cave, they left behind stone tools and fragments of themselves, a finger bone, a tooth, a hint. For a long time, that's all we had. But DNA told a richer story. Their blood still flows, in small percentages, through people living in Melanesia, in parts of Southeast Asia, in the highlands of Tibet. It's more than a scientific detail. It means that long after most of the world forgot them, Denisovans lived on, in rocky ranges, in hidden valleys, in places where the cold preserved what the world had left behind. We can almost picture it, a small band climbing the slopes at dawn, the frost crunching beneath their feet, firelight flickering against stone walls, a mother humming softly as she braids her child's hair, a father carving a tool, worn hands still steady. Survival became a kind of ritual. One more winter, one more hunt, one more breath, but even the strongest bones crack under the weight of time. As the Ice Age reshaped the planet, ancient refuges turned into traps, glaciers crept across valleys, storms grew fiercer, paths between mountains became impassable. Isolation, once a shield, became a prison. Population sizes may have dwindled into the dozens. When someone died, they weren't just a loved one lost. They were one less thread in a fragile web, one less voice in the darkness. Extinction, in the end, isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it comes in the quiet moments, when the last mother can no longer bear children, when the last child grows up alone, when the last campfire burns low and no one is left to tend it. And yet, even in disappearance, they left behind echoes. A gene that helps Tibetans breathe in thin air? That's Denisovan. A protein that strengthens immune systems in modern Pacific Islanders? That's them too. Their bodies may have faded, but their presence endures. They were the final holdouts, guardians of the past, witnesses to a world that was slipping away. And maybe, just maybe, as the stars rose over their cold, quiet homes, they looked up and wondered, as we do now, why are we the only ones left? Somewhere on a windswept coastline, or deep within the shelter of a cave, the last of the Neanderthals stood alone, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but truly, physically, the very last of their kind. No one knows their name, no record marks their passing, but there must have been one final heartbeat, one last set of footprints fading behind, one pair of eyes that saw the world for the last time through the lens of a species that had survived glaciers, predators, hunger, and time itself. Perhaps it was a woman, old and weathered, bones aching from years of foraging and cold nights. Maybe she knew her family was gone, that the others had fallen ill, or drifted away, or disappeared into the unknown forests. She might have sat by a fire one final time, warming her hands with the last embers of a world that once teemed with her kin. Or perhaps it was a young man, solitary by nature, never knowing he was the last. He would have carried on the rhythms of life, sharpening stone blades, scanning the trees for movement, pressing his ear to the wind for sounds of danger or companionship that would never come. He wouldn't have realized that no voices like his remained, that every sound he made was now an echo, that no other Neanderthal would ever answer back. Somewhere in a place untouched by us now, the end happened not in fire or fury, but in silence. There are bones, yes, fragments of what might have been the final few, some found in Gibraltar's coastal caves, tucked behind limestone walls with views that stretch endlessly out to sea. Archaeologists believe these may represent some of the last Neanderthals who ever lived, clinging to a dwindling corner of the world as the Ice Age retreated, and with it, the last safe places for their kind. Those caves are quiet now, but once they held laughter, breathing, stories whispered in the dark, the warmth of skin beside skin in the cold, the hush of snow falling on stone, the last moments of a lineage that had walked this earth for over 300,000 years. What did they think of us, those early Homo sapiens? Did they view us with curiosity, caution, hope? Did they try to speak with us, trade, learn, or did they simply watch from behind trees or across valleys as we spread and multiplied, bringing with us fire and song and things that felt like magic? It's possible the final Neanderthal never met another of their own, that their childhood memories were filled with others who slowly, one by one, faded, that they wandered in search of voices that never returned, and died still looking. The weight of that loneliness is hard to grasp, because this wasn't just a person. This was a language, a worldview, a way of being, disappearing with a single breath. Imagine, just for a moment, being the last speaker of a language no one else knows, calling out into the wind with words that no longer belong to anyone but you, eating meals in silence, staring at the stars, and wondering if the gods of your people have gone quiet too. And yet, perhaps they didn't feel alone. Perhaps they didn't know they were the last. The mind doesn't often grasp the enormity of extinction. It clings to tasks, to memories, to the here and now. Maybe in their final days, they simply did what they always had, followed the game trails, gathered berries, sang the songs of their mothers, tended a fire, waited for the sun, and then they were gone. The earth did not shudder, no sky split open, no burial marked the moment, but something ended. An entire species, intelligent, emotional, artistic, vanished into time, not with ceremony, but with stillness, a final flicker of warmth in the long night. But, even in death, they did not vanish completely. Their blood mingled with ours long before that final breath. Their genes live on, tucked quietly into the fabric of many people alive today. A kind of biological memory, a whisper in the bones, and through that, they are not entirely gone. Still, when we imagine that last Neanderthal, alone in the vastness of the wild, carrying the weight of a world that no longer belonged to them, it forces us to look inward. What does it mean to be the last? What does it mean to survive when so many others do not? And as the wind moves through those ancient caves, as the sea crashes endlessly against the rocks, it carries a silence, the silence left behind by the ones who are no longer here. Not forgotten, not erased, but missed in ways we're only just beginning to understand. What if they had survived? The Neanderthals with their quiet strength, the Denisovans with their ghostly DNA, the hobbits of Flores, the small-brained but possibly spiritual naledi, all still here, walking beside us, not fossilized in stone or buried in caves, but living, breathing, building families, speaking languages we've never heard. Imagine a city not built by Homo sapiens alone, a skyline shaped by multiple minds, a place where some hands were broad and powerful, made for crafting stone and lifting timber, and others were slender and precise, designed for delicate threads and whispered scrolls. What would our cultures look like if we had learned to grow together instead of replacing one another? Would there have been statues in our plazas, not just of one kind of human, but many? Would history books have begun with phrases like, "In the age when all the peoples walked"? Would classrooms be filled with children of 3 or 4 human types, learning songs from different evolutionary lineages, painting with shared colors from vastly different minds? Or would it have gone another way? Would we have built borders not just between nations, but between species? Signs on doors reading "Sapiens only," laws passed in fear, not understanding, 1,000 small cruelties wrapped in flags and myths. Would our museums be filled with bones not because time buried them, but because we chose to erase them? Would the word human have been carved narrower and narrower until it meant only us? It's hard to say, because humans, all kinds, carry the seed of compassion and also the spark of division. We gather around firelight and cradle our young with songs, but we also fear what is different, what is other. And yet, there's something hauntingly beautiful about the possibility, not of conquest, but of coexistence. A Neanderthal healer who knows the forest by scent alone, a Denisovan astronomer mapping the stars in ways we never considered, a Homo floresiensis philosopher sitting cross-legged beneath a banyan tree, telling stories passed down through 100,000 years of island time. Would our science have been shaped by different senses? Would our music have been richer, more voices, more rhythms, more soul? What inventions would exist today if minds shaped by different brains had contributed to the human journey? Would we have cured more diseases, understood death differently, looked at the stars and imagined other futures? And what would love look like in a world where the boundaries of species were softer? Would there be families mixed and many-colored, speaking dialects only they understood? Would the word family have stretched wider, embraced more? Or perhaps, in a quieter possibility, they would not have lived in our cities at all. Maybe they would have remained in the forests, the mountains, the shadows of the world, choosing silence over spectacle. And maybe we would have respected that, visited on pilgrimage, listened more than we spoke. Children would have grown up hearing not just bedtime stories of elves and giants, but tales of real, living cousins who preferred the cold wind and the deep caves. But none of this happened. We don't know if it could have happened, because now, when we speak of humanity, we mean just us. One kind of human, a single surviving thread in what was once a tapestry. Still, we carry them with us, not just in DNA, but in questions, in echoes, in what might have been, and in the quiet places of the world, the untouched valleys, the sacred mountains, the ancient woods, there are those who still wonder. What if we weren't alone? What if the world had turned just slightly differently? Not for conquest, not for dominance, but for something gentler. A world where humanity wasn't a narrow category, but a chorus. Even though they're gone, the others never really left. They're not just names in dusty books or skeletons behind museum glass. They're in us, around us, beneath our skin. They echo in ways we don't always see, shaping our health, our fears, our instincts. Every time your heart races in the dark, that's not just imagination, it's memory, a memory older than language, older than fire, back when night meant danger, when glowing eyes in the brush might not be animals, but others like us, competing, watching, hunting the same game, drinking from the same river, long before cities, before laws, long before the word human meant just one kind of being. We were already learning what it meant to survive alongside rivals and sometimes enemies. Those instincts haven't vanished. They whisper quietly in our blood, a sudden reaction to strangers, a deep need to belong to a group. That strange, uneasy feeling when someone seems different. These aren't flaws, they're ancient, traces of a time when the difference between survival and extinction might have been as small as a look, a gesture, a decision made under pressure. Even our bodies remember. Studies have found that pain tolerance varies between populations, not because of culture, but because of genes passed down from Neanderthals. Denisovan DNA may have gifted some of us the ability to thrive at high altitudes, a quiet adaptation etched into our lungs, passed on from mountain dwellers we never knew. Immune responses, skin tone, even how we process fat and heat, much of it comes from those who once walked beside us, then faded from view. But perhaps most quietly, they shaped the way we think. Personality traits, mood disorders, a tendency toward introversion or hyperawareness. Some researchers believe the genes we carry may subtly nudge how our minds respond to the world, how we feel stress, how we bond, how we grieve. It's like we're living with ghosts, not in the haunted house sense, but in the soft, invisible way that the past is never really gone. It hums beneath every heartbeat. It whispers through our cells. Even in art and story, there are echoes. The monsters we imagine, towering, hairy, half-human figures lurking in caves or shadows. The stories of forest spirits, stone-skinned beings, watchers in the hills, could they be distant memories? Flickers passed down from ancestors who did meet other humans, who saw them, fought them, loved them. What if those tales aren't pure fiction, but distorted memories, reshaped over millennia, polished into myth by firelight and fear? We think of the Ice Age as a time of brutal survival, and it was, but it was also a time of closeness, of fires shared in silence, of lessons passed from elder to child without words, through touch, through rhythm, through the tilt of a head or the cadence of a breath. Some of the deepest parts of us, the parts that flinch before reason, that ache for home, that long for the warmth of a shared circle, they aren't modern, they are ancient. Neanderthal, Denisovan, sapiens, all mixed together in a silent symphony. And that's the strange, beautiful thing. Even though they're gone, even though we speak their names like distant memories, we still carry them, not just in bone, not just in genes, but in the way we gather, the way we mourn, the way we hope, a flicker in the eye, a twitch in the hand, a hesitation before we act. Every breath we take is layered with history, a story we didn't write, but are still telling. And somewhere, deep inside the parts of us we can't see, they are still there, watching, listening, living through us. When a species disappears, it doesn't just vanish from the earth, it disappears from possibility. And with the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and all the other ancient humans now gone, we didn't just lose bodies in the fossil record. We lost worlds, whole ways of being, ways of thinking, seeing, hearing, feeling, that may have been just as rich, just as valid, just as profound as our own. Imagine an intelligence that developed differently from ours, not better or worse, just parallel. Perhaps the Neanderthal mind understood the forest in a way we never will. Perhaps their senses were tuned to the rustle of prey in the snow, the shift in the wind before a storm, the weight of a glance in a quiet group. What if they saw patterns we missed? What if their stories, passed in gestures and silence, held wisdom that needed no words? But those stories are gone now, silenced not by choice, but by extinction. And it wasn't just one silence, it was many. Each human species that vanished took with it a different voice, a different rhythm of thought, a unique way of navigating the world. Some may have been more tactile, learning through touch, through movement, through the way pressure shifts against skin and stone. Others may have seen color or shadow with a different weight than we do, noticing shades we've never named. Their language, if they had it, may have danced differently across the tongue, shaped by throat and tooth, and breath in ways no modern dialect has captured. What we lost wasn't just them, it was perspective, and that loss is quiet. We don't see it in the headlines, we don't feel it in our daily routines, but it's there, hidden in what we no longer imagine. We live in a world designed by a single kind of human, us, our tools, our cities, our systems of learning, our beliefs about intelligence and success. They all reflect one way of being, one neurological architecture, one brain shape, one kind of body. But what if there had been others, not in textbooks, not in labs, but beside us, in classrooms, in communities, in governments? What might the world look like if we had shared it with minds that saw time differently, or felt emotion more directly, or moved through space with a different sense of gravity? Would we have built the same cities? Would we have told the same stories? Would we have made the same mistakes? When we think about extinction, we often picture the body, the skeleton in the dirt, the skull behind glass. But there's another kind of extinction, a quieter one, the extinction of culture, the extinction of a song no one sings anymore, of a gesture that no hand remembers, of a kind of laughter, or mourning, or joy that no longer exists on this earth. And in that silence, there's a kind of grief that's hard to name. We mourn them not just because they were like us, but because they were not, because they were different, and difference is a kind of richness the world can't afford to lose. It's easy to think of us, Homo sapiens, as the pinnacle, but maybe we're not the conclusion of evolution, just its current draft. Maybe those we lost were early chapters in a story that was never meant to be read by just one voice. If they were still here, we might have been forced to listen harder, to slow down, to accept that human doesn't mean one thing, doesn't belong to one form or one mind. Their presence might have made us more humble, more patient, more curious about what intelligence really is. But now, that door is closed. Not slammed shut in violence, perhaps, but sealed by time, by climate, by slow and silent attrition, and all we're left with is wonder. Wonder at what their laughter sounded like. Wonder at what they dreamed under a sky we now call our own. Wonder at what we might have learned had we listened, had we not been the only ones left to tell the story. And yet the story isn't over, because in the next breath we take, in the bones beneath our skin, in the faint shadows of ancient code woven through our DNA, something of them remains, waiting, lingering, whispering across time. For all our strength, all our progress, all the satellites we've sent into orbit, and the machines we've trained to speak, we are still fragile. We tend to see ourselves as inevitable, as if Homo sapiens was always meant to dominate, always destined to be here. But history tells a more delicate truth. There was a moment many thousands of years ago when we almost vanished, not in legend, not in metaphor, but in blood and breath. Genetic studies suggest that at one point, our entire species may have dwindled to fewer than 10,000 individuals. Some estimates go even lower. That's not the population of a city. That's a village. A small, isolated group of humans huddled together while the rest of the world turned cold. It may have been triggered by a sudden climate shift, a volcanic eruption blotting out the sun, or an ice age tightening its grip. Whatever it was, it almost erased us. All of us. We came that close, a flicker away from joining the ranks of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others, whose names we only know because someone found a fossil at the right time. Yet somehow we held on. Somehow the thread didn't snap. And here we are, 8 billion strong, scattered across continents, wrapped in cities of concrete and light. But strength in numbers is not the same as security. The world we live in today is vast, interconnected, and breathtakingly complex, but it is also unstable. We have the power to communicate instantly across the planet, and also the power to poison that planet faster than ever before. We've pushed the climate into unfamiliar territory. Ice is melting in places it's held for millions of years. Oceans are rising, storms are strengthening, heat waves linger where they never used to, and behind it all, the systems that once protected us, crops, weather cycles, even fresh water, are beginning to tremble. We are not separate from the Earth. We are part of its nervous system, and when the planet shifts, we do too. Then there are the invisible threats. Viruses, for example, have always been with us. But in today's world, one virus can circle the globe in days. We saw it recently how quickly cities fell silent, hospitals filled, borders closed. We glimpsed for a moment how thin the veil really is between control and collapse. That was one virus. There could be others, worse, faster, more silent. Some may come from nature, others from ourselves, bred in labs, or emerging from forgotten ice as ancient permafrost melts and things long buried return to the air. And then there's us. Our own hands may be the greatest threat we face. Weapons built to destroy cities, fires lit by greed or accident, divides deepened by fear, by scarcity, by the refusal to see each other as family. We've grown so powerful, yet still so easily shaken. We've conquered the mountain, but we're dancing on the edge of it. The truth is, survival is not a prize we win once and keep forever. It is something we have to earn again and again through care, through humility, through memory, because even now the echoes of the past hum beneath our feet. Once we stood shoulder to shoulder with others who walked upright, made fire, loved, hunted, learned, and they are gone. Their bones lie silent, but their absence speaks. It reminds us we are not untouchable. We are not alone in the story of life. For all our brilliance, we are just one more thread in a vast tapestry, fraying in places, beautiful in others, held together by hope and shared breath. So as we race forward, building, consuming, expanding, we must remember how narrow the road has been and how narrow it could become again. Our survival is not guaranteed, but maybe that's what makes it precious. We often speak of humanity as if it were a single thread, unbroken, inevitable, self contained. But if you listen closely, really listen, you'll hear the rustle of others who once walked beside us. They were not ghosts, not legends. They breathed, they bled, they raised children beneath ancient stars, warmed their hands by fire, and watched their skies for meaning, just as we do now. There were Neanderthals with eyes perhaps a little softer than ours, who may have sung lullabies into caves, Denisovans who shaped tools in silence, whose fingerprints vanished long before history began, tiny hobbit-like people on islands, clever and strange, who vanished into the forest without a trace. Others, too, names barely spoken, their bones still cradled in the earth, their stories still waiting to be told. And now, it's just us, not because we were destined, not because we deserved to win, but perhaps because through luck or language or sheer stubbornness, we lasted longer than the rest. Yet in surviving, we did not come through untouched. Their shadows still live inside us, in our cells, our instincts, our dreams, in the parts of our DNA that whisper from ancient campsites and snow-covered mountain passes. When you look at your reflection, you are not only seeing Homo sapiens, you are seeing a mosaic, the legacy of wanderers, fighters, lovers, thinkers, all bundled into one fragile, determined species. One species that has loved and lost far more than it remembers. We weren't always alone, and we won't always be. One day, something else may stand where we stand now, something born from our minds or born from time itself. It may look back on us with wonder or with sorrow, or not at all. That is the nature of being human, to live at the edge of memory, to carry light through the dark, not knowing how long it will last. But for now, in this brief electric moment between extinction and eternity, we get to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? Maybe it means storytelling, passing what we've seen and felt and feared into the hands of those we'll never meet. Maybe it means remembering not only the winners of history, but the ones who disappeared quietly, leaving behind only ashes and a few forgotten tools. And maybe, above all, it means empathy, the kind of empathy that allows us to imagine what it felt like to be the last Neanderthal, sitting in the mouth of a cave, listening to wind sweep across empty valleys, knowing you were the end of your kind, feeling your own breath, soft and shallow, while the rest of the world moved on. If you could speak to them now, just one moment, one whisper carried across 40,000 years, what would you say? Would you apologize? Would you promise to remember them? Would you ask them how it felt to watch their world fade? That is your question now. Leave a comment below. Speak not just to me, but to them, to the ones we lost and the ones we carry within us. And if this story touched something in you, share it with someone who still believes the past matters, with someone who dreams of campfires and stars. Subscribe, not just to a channel, but to an idea that memory is resistance, that silence can still be broken, that even in the dark, stories can keep the flame alive, because they were human too, and as long as we speak their names, they are not entirely gone.